in your procrastination to not work on an essay, you have finished The Giver by Lois Lowry. The Giver is actually like the first in a series of 4 books. I will hopefully be finishing all 4 of the books before camp ends, but that's besides the point. I initially read this book when I was in 7th grade, I think. Yeah, 7th grade. So I don't know if I'm gonna make a playlist that's like, here's all the books that I read when I was in middle school, and here's all the books I read in high school. Anyway, that's besides the point. The Giver touches on a lot of really interesting ideas, right? Sameness, life without pain, beauty without pain. Can we actually experience life without pain? Like the first half of really the first like third of the novel is trying to explain what Jonas's life is like, of where everything is the same. You know, there's no competition for things. There's no life is just perfect. And then we transition into the second third is really Jonah's first experiences with memories of what life was like before we created this situation. And then the last third is the idea of the plan of remaking all the memories and sharing them with the community and things like that, right? It's a really interesting take, right? And the reason that like I would argue that we read this at like a middle school level is because we're really trying to get people to think about and get students to think about why we have to experience certain things and why sometimes suffering is important. Because really that's really what this novel comes down to, right? Is that if we only had to share feelings of warmth and love and things like that and like happiness, then we would only be striving for those things at all times. But in order to understand those things and make sense of them, we also have to understand what it is like to not have those feelings, right? As was kind of explained in the book, right, is that there's the receiver, which is the job title that Jonas is given. Prior to that, 10 years before Jonas, there was another receiver who had tried and then asked for release, which is just death. It's a lethal injection. 10 years prior, and that those memories then got shared throughout the community because the person who had the memories died. And something that I don't remember ever being brought up when I was younger was this idea that like physical pain on the surface is much more difficult to deal with than emotional pain, right? And that is why the giver gives Rosemary all of these emotional burdens first when she's trying to experience pain. And it's because on the surface level, physical pain is worse than emotional pain. But in reality, and the way that this actually works, is that emotional pain and emotional burdens are much harder to hold than physical ones. And of course, that is a mistake that is going to be made by people who've never actually experienced these things, right? The giver only has the memories of what happened beforehand. He's never experienced them himself, right? So that's why he transfers the emotional pain first, because he can't bear to deal with the fact that he's going to give the person who is his daughter actual physical pain, right? So there's that really interesting contrast that I don't know if Lois Lowry intended to put in there, but the overall idea that emotional pain is much, much deeper and much more burdensome than physical pain. Yeah, it's just a really interesting concept of the world that Lois Lowry has created, in which everything is the same and everything has to go through processes and, you know, things like that. And it's a fascinating idea, right? It's you train everyone to fear decisions, because any decision that a person makes for themselves is something that can be harmful. And if you are trying to live a perfect world in which there is no harm, you can also therefore have no choices for those people. So, interesting bit of thing there, I guess, right? It's kind of a weird concept, right? But in order to understand this book, you just have to understand that Lois Lowry's argument really seems to be that in order for us to understand the love, warmth, sunshine part of things, we also have to understand war and famine, and loneliness and loss, right? The reason that love feels the way that it does is because we understand what it's like to lose someone. Now, for myself, to really imagine this, or to anyone else watching this, because I assume that there's probably some middle school kid watching this going, I don't know, I don't understand the giver. There's a point in your life, right, of where, and maybe you can picture this, right, is that you love someone very, very deeply, whether that be your parents, your grandparents, something like that. The love you feel for them in that moment is fantastic, and it's great, and it's warmth. And then you lose them, right? You lose your parent, you lose your grandparent, you lose your dog, right? That love is still there, but now it's kind of crowded with this loss. From that point on, because you now understand this love and loss relationship, the people and the things that you love from that point on, you love much more deeply, because you understand that at one point they will be lost. That's really the best way I can think about trying to explain that. Yeah. It's, you know, another big theme to focus on is this idea of, like, you burden one person so heavily so that everyone else can live satisfying lives, right? Which is fine, right? It's an idea that gets passed around a lot, of one person takes the brunt of a lot of issues so that other people can go out living their lives. But the question is, does that really work, right? This is like the extreme version of that, right? Of where you have one person who holds all the memories, both the good and the bad, so that everyone else can live healthy, safe lives. But really the question is, do those lives matter if they don't feel anything? If they don't feel what it is to suffer, but they also don't feel what it is to love? Does a person's life mean anything then? it gets kind of explored, right? In fairly early on, Jonas is bathing an elderly woman, and she is talking about the releases or the deaths of two different members. There's Edna and there's Roberto. Edna is someone who was a birth mother, so she gave birth to 3 children who were then passed to other members of the community, and then was a laborer, and then she was never like assigned a spouse, and she was never assigned a family. So like her life in terms of physical meaning wasn't a whole lot. But does that mean that her life didn't matter in general? The same thing goes for the Roberto who gets mentioned. Is Roberto did all these things, all great achievements, but does his life end up meaning more than Edna? That's the real question here. But yeah, all fascinating things. I think back to when I was in 7th grade. There's the wet dream scene, right? Of the stirrings of, you know, how do you read that? How do you respond to that, right? I really don't know how to, but really it's like just overall this idea of really from what I can understand, it's the community's idea is that these desires or urges are what then cause things like sexuality and assault and things like that, right? It's the urges that then lead to the actions, right? And it's because they can't trust anyone with the urges, therefore they don't want to have anyone have the actions, therefore they get rid of the urges, right? That's basically the way that this works. You know, fair enough, I guess. You know, I'm not one to I'm not going to stand up here and say, no, you have to have it, because you shouldn't, right? But it's one of those really interesting topics to really go about doing. Oh, the other thing. I remember when I was in 7th grade, I had this whole discussion about the pale eyes. And I don't know if this is true or not. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the idea was that people with paler eyes, so like blue eyes, could take in more light or more wavelengths than people with darker eyes. And I don't know if that's true. And I don't think it is, but it's one of those like interesting things that as I think I was like 12, 13 at the time, like, you know, it's an interesting idea of like, it's the people with pale eyes that then have this ability to see beyond, and it's because their eyes can just allow more wavelength in, which is then how they see color. You know, I don't know what it is. If that was the case, I would definitely not be a seer or a receiver, because boy, do I got some dark brown eyes. Yeah, that's pretty much my thoughts on The Giver. Oh, I guess the ending, right? The ending, like, it goes into this whole idea of like, it's Jonas creating his own new memories, which is really interesting, and they mimic the original memories, him reliving his own memory, which is interesting. It's an interesting way to present this, right? Because basically, like, the way it ends up working is that he has lost all of his memories by going so far away from the village. He's lost all of them, except for like this like faint feeling that he has of them. So then when he gets up to the top and he gets on the sled, he is reliving his own memory, right? Which is really, really interesting. Yeah, yeah. Book-wise or rating-wise, I really like The Giver. I always have. I think it's my third time reading through it, I think. I read through it in 7th grade. And then probably like freshman or sophomore year of high school. I definitely got a lot more out of it this time than I did the other times because I actually read it. I also read it in one sitting, which is probably important. This took me about 2 hours to read. 2.5 probably. But yeah. Numbers wise, 8. I really do like The Giver. I think this would be a book that I would love to teach. And I know I probably won't be able to because of all the things that are going on in education right now, but I really do love The Giver, and I really would love to teach this book. It's just a matter of, can I? And that's it. That's all I got.